Yep.
What do we got?
Testing for cards.
Just gonna wait on
Perfect. So thank you folks for coming to the third workshop for the day. So before we begin, before the workshops, we want to obviously take the time to acknowledge that this building and this land occupies a portion of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations land. And as settlers on this land, it is our responsibility to honor, to protect and to sustain it, but also to, in our conversation, be cognizant of the continual project of colonization and colonialism. We also want to work collectively to create safer spaces. So oftentimes the mic will be passed around to have question and answer, and we're happy about having dialogue and discourse, but we ask that everyone be cognizant of the language, the actions, and being cognizant of sharing the space collectively. So this workshop is both simultaneously translated into ASL, and also we're using cart service. So just housekeeping notes. Oftentimes when the mic gets passed around, if one of the interpreters asks you to repeat something or to clarify a name or to clarify something, just do that and be okay with being interrupted. The same thing with cart also. We oftentimes the computer will freeze, or if you're not speaking directly into the mic, our card translators from Texas won't be able to hear you. So just make sure that everyone, if you ever speak into a mic, that you're speaking directly into it. And if you, yeah, that's generally it. So yes, we're going to pass it along to Sobriety as Accessibility, Interrogating Intoxicating Culture. And we have moderators and speakers.
Thank you, Kylie. Victor, are you good? Okay.
Sure. My name is Saunders. I'll be talking about the relationship between drugs, alcohol, nationalism, and colonialism, and I will be the last speaker of the panel.
Hi everyone, I'm Clementine Morrigan, and I'm going to be looking at intoxication culture through a gender lens.
Hi, my name is Geoff, and I'm going to be examining the addict constructed through normal and abnormal body, and also the addict as disposable.
My name is James Damaskinos. I'm a moderator for this event. I'm a second-year law student at Osgoode Hall in York University, and I'm very excited to have this conversation with you guys.
My name is Quinto Zimmerman. I'm also one of the moderators for this event. I'm a disability activist in Toronto, and I'm really pleased to be here with all of you.
So I'm just going to start.
I should be dead. Isn't that how the story usually goes? Boy is troubled, he rebels. Boy gets into drugs, he has fun for a bit. Boy begins to struggle, he becomes addicted and continues to struggle. Boy continues to struggle even more, becomes desperate and lifeless. Boy is found dead. Or is the story that someone struggles with addiction and the family gathers itself to initiate an intervention? We all have a common imagination and understanding of what addiction is and what it looks like. What does the addict or the alcoholic look like? What does the non-addictive figure look like? When you think about addiction, do you first think about death, destruction, and decay before you would ever think about life and beauty? When you imagine an addicted, drug-infested area in the city, do you first think about areas like Parkdale, Regent Park, or Queen and Sherbourne before you would ever think about Bay Street?
What would you say about Parkdale? I live in Parkdale.
I live in Parkdale too. Addiction is more than the tragedy and the intervention. Addiction is more than fighting stigma and more than a defeat denial campaign. Addiction is rich with experience, histories, and stories. Addiction warps the idea of what a life should be and what kind of life is considered worth living. Addiction is more than a life just waiting to die. Do we regularly think about addiction in this way? For the purpose of this presentation, I'll be proposing a theory. A person's relationship to a particular substance, in conjunction with their identity markers, works to govern how this person is treated and how they treat others. I will begin by describing the concepts that have influenced this theory. starting with the individual and social models of disability, followed by discussing the idea of intoxication culture. Next, I will describe how normative drinking works to construct the abnormal addict. I will continue to describe how intoxication culture works to socially construct addiction as a life not worth living. I will conclude my talk by conceptualizing sobriety as accessibility and resistance. Before I begin, I would like to highlight the scope of our presentation. Our work and talk will primarily focus on the construction of the addicted and non-addicted body. We are not here to discuss the different reasons why people use substances, but how these choices impact people's lives. I would like to acknowledge that everyone in this room has a different relationship to substances, whether you use or not. Further, intoxication culture impacts our communities in different ways. Clementine will discuss the impact of intoxication culture on women, and Amy will discuss the intersections of colonization, class, race, and addiction. I would like to highlight that intoxication culture affects our gay, lesbian, transgender, queer, racialized, recovery, and disabled communities in different ways. Lastly, for us, we're not just talking theory. For us, we're discussing our lives at stake here. Mike Oliver describes the individual model of disability as locating disability within the individual compared to the social model that locates disability in the organization of society. The individual model would describe disability as a problem in need of a solution. Further, disability would be defined as an abnormal, inhibiting condition that requires medical intervention in order to bring this condition to the closest state of a normal body. The individual model would describe addiction as an individual problem and such a tragedy. Addiction is understood as a chronic, progressive, and fatal illness, and if you do not pursue rehab or treatment, the rest of your life will be miserable until the day you die. In contrast, the social model of disability would argue that society works to disable people by creating barriers, either physical or social, that work to exclude and restrict society's interaction with individuals. In this way, society disables people by promoting cultures of exclusion through creating barriers instead of creating cultures of inclusion by creating access. For example, if there was a series of steps that would lead into the room, people using a mobility device like a motorized scooter or wheelchair would face a barrier to entering the room. In this way, the building planning and architecture work to disable people who use mobility devices. The stairs would be a physical barrier, where the lack of consideration for people that use mobility devices would be the social barrier. Having a ramp in addition to stairs would be a way of creating access into this room. What would an application of the social model look like in relation to addiction? In her blog titled Leaving Evidence, disability justice organizer Mia Mingus wrote, "We must, however, move beyond access by itself. We cannot allow the liberation of disabled people to be boiled down to logistics. We must understand and practice an accessibility that moves us closer to justice, not just inclusion or diversity." Disability studies scholar Eliza Chandler reaffirming this work, saying, "Accessibility is more than just creating access into a room. It's about promoting a culture of access and justice within a space." Is there a possibility of justice for the addict? Or is the idea of justice negated by the emphasis that addiction is an individual problem, not a societal problem? In Towards a Less Fucked Up World, Sobriety and Anarchist Struggle, Nick Ryfag defines intoxication culture as a set of institutions, behaviors, and mindsets centered around consumption of drugs and alcohol. Intoxication culture can be thought as a weekend ritual of getting wasted, the glorified culture of drug dealing, the Canadian identity of beer drinking and peace-loving citizens projected by most Canadian, or even simply having a glass of wine with a meal, or even this weekend celebrating for St. Paddy's Day as well too. We live in a culture that promotes substance use as a way of medicating the body and mind, as well as a social lubricant that offers an escape from the pressures of reality. We live in a culture that rewards those who use particular substances in a particular way, while punishing those who do not use substances in this way. Could we consider intoxication culture a societal barrier that restricts access for the social participation of addicts? Within intoxication culture, there is a drug hierarchy that works to dictate what ideal substance use should be. At the top of this hierarchy, I would argue that the consumption of alcohol in a fun yet controlled way is the preferred type of substance use. This normative substance use is a standard that others are judged. How many addicts or alcoholics in this room have ever wished that they could just use normally? By judging ourselves against the norm, we work to define ourselves as the abnormal. What does alcohol use look like in comparison to crack or heroin use? On the opposite end of the spectrum, chronic, compulsive crack, crystal meth, heroin use, or even recently bath salt use, is quite the undesired form of use. In this way, it's not just your relationship to what substance you use, but how you use it that impacts the way you're treated. For example, for a bunch of Bay Street bankers, socializing over drinks at a bar may lead to building networks and closing business deals. In this way, drinking aids to materially and socially benefit these bankers by maintaining their class privilege. In contrast, a group of homeless people drinking on the street corner gives police due cause to start questioning this group and potentially arresting them. Further, due to their class status, homeless individuals are excluded from private places to drink and are forced to drink in public spaces like bathrooms, parks, and the streets, where they become highly visible. In these examples, class status, the type of drink, how the drinking occurs, and the space where the drinking occurs differentially affects how a person is treated. The bankers are rewarded through privilege, and the homeless group is punished. When we begin to think about a person's relationship to a substance, and consider their social location, we can begin to understand how the treatment is legitimized and injustice occurs. Further, instead of examining addiction as an individual problem, we can begin to examine how addiction is perpetuated by systemic factors like lack of affordable housing, poverty, and social isolation. As part of the Defeat Denial campaign, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, created an ad that reads as follows, in quotations and in capital letters or capital writing. Anyone can quit, just try harder.
Oh.
Following, it reads, most people don't understand addiction. That's why 2 out of 3 people suffer in silence. In my paper titled, Rolling with the Sickness, Our Lives Are Not Just Pain, I argue that CAMH needs non-addicted people to understand addiction as suffering in order to convince them to refer addicts to their institution and legitimize their position. As suggested earlier, normative drinking is done in a fun yet controlled way. This ad would suggest that for people who cannot quit, that there is something wrong with them. In this way, addiction is then understood as lacking in capacity, the inability to cope and stop. The non-addicted person needs to understand addiction as unable is abnormal in order to affirm their position as able is normal. Further, non-addicted people need to understand addiction as suffering, otherwise there would be no point of referring them to CAMH, and the likes as well too. In the book titled Rethinking Normalcy, a Disability Studies reader, Rod Michalko asserts that suffering becomes normalized for the disabled body. When addiction is only thought of as an abnormal suffering condition, it is then easy to think of addiction as an individual problem in need of a solution that can alleviate this condition. Additionally, suffering is naturalized for the addict. If a person is using substances in addictive ways, suffering is expected to be a part of that experience. When suffering is normalized and naturalized for the addict, rehabilitation and treatment are legitimized to only address addiction as an individual problem, not a systemic one. As an addict in recovery, suffering is part of my experience, but it's not my whole story. I often say that addicts are viewed as the scum of the earth. When we don't comply to normative intoxication culture, if we are sober, we are thought of as boring. In contrast, if we are using substances in an abnormal way, we are thought of as hopelessly weak and eventually considered to be a lost cause. When addicts are thought of as write-offs, the consequences are violent and deadly. In the book titled Society Must Be Defended, Michel Foucault states, biopolitics deals with the population as a political problem, as a problem that is at once scientific and political, as a biological problem, and as power's problem. Following, in the book Terror Assemblages, Homo Nationalism in Queer Times, Jesper Pouar furthers this concept of biopolitics, asserting that in the biopolitical control of populations, no one is left out, though many are left behind. Addicts are part of a population that is to be left behind, to be killed or to be left for dead. 2 summers ago, a dear friend of mine was living in a sober supportive living house, and one of his roommates went missing. The missing roommate was found dead in his room and had overdosed. He had been dead for over 24 hours. Emergency services carried the late gentleman out on a stretcher, not a body bag. As EMS proceeded to carry out his body, his head hit the wall. My friend said that he was treated just like any other addict. Although dead, this man was considered to be not deserving of a body bag. This story illustrated how addicts are considered to be disposable and less than human. If this is how addicts are treated when they are dead, how are addicts treated when they are alive? Is there a difference? If addicts are considered to be a population of write-offs, would that not assert that we are already considered dead? Earlier this week, former drunk, harm reduction worker, and dear friend Patrick pointed out that it's worthwhile to consider sobriety as a barrier to accessibility for people dealing with addictions, but not in a position to become abstinent. This is significant because these addicts exist the furthest on the margins and are the most susceptible to the violent consequences as a result of their substance use. When considering sobriety as accessibility, how can we create communities of inclusion, not exclusion, to addicts who are not sober? As an addict, I would not consider my sobriety to be radical. I'm staying sober for my life. I would consider it to be a point of privilege in my marginalized experience. Additionally, I would consider drinking to be a privilege for non-addicted people. A person who has a choice to drink, that chooses not to drink in a context where the expectation is to drink, is a form of radical sobriety. To the non-addicted who have a choice in drink in this room, would you consider this choice to be a privilege? If not, how come? If so, what do you do with this privilege? Do you use your privilege to create communities of exclusion or inclusion? Does your choice in drink promote unity among your communities, or does it create divisions? Does the culture of intoxication you participate in work to create access or barriers to those of us addicted? To the addicted who are sober and participate in 12-step fellowships, do you feel your compulsion to drink or use is really just your problem? Or does intoxication culture affect your addiction and alcoholism? It's important to note that as addicts and alcoholics, we will always exist on the margins of normalcy, no matter how clean or sober we get. This is important because with sobriety comes the expectation of conformity to normative societal roles. Is this what you always wanted, to be normal? Aside from your participation in 12-step fellowships, have you ever considered politicizing your sobriety? Have you ever considered sobriety as resistance? Will you work to navigate systems of normalcy, knowing you are different, or will you use your privilege in sobriety to seek justice for marginalized communities? To the addicted who are sober but who do not attend 12-step meetings, to the addicted who use and have complex relationships with substances, to the addicted who prefer harm reduction over abstinence, to non-addicted who have complicated relationships with substances related to experiences of abuse or violence, to the non-addicted whose lifestyle choices do not allow them to participate in normative drinking, to the folks who use medication and substances to manage pain, your experiences disrupt normalcy. Please continue to share your experiences as it works to challenge imaginations of what addiction is and how intoxication culture affects everyone in different ways. I would like to close with a quote from Nick Ragfag. Instead of being accountable to authority, I want us to be actually accountable to each other. A pretty important part is that being able to come together as radical communities and have conversations about how alcohol and drugs impacts our work, our spaces, our relationships, and our unity, and to figure out what sorts of agreements and boundaries make sense for us. Thank you.
Intoxication culture is a culture that defines a normal person as a person who drinks and who drinks normally. Normal drinking, often referred to as social drinking, is a broad range of behaviors, including drinking alcohol with a meal, getting drunk on the weekends as a social activity, including alcohol as part of celebrations, serving alcohol during social and professional events, and generally taking it for granted that consuming alcohol is a normal part of adult life. Like all categories positioned as normal, normal drinking is defined by what it deems as abnormal. Intoxication culture needs addicts and alcoholics to perform the role of abnormal in order to define itself as the norm. Addicts and alcoholics are the shadow of intoxication culture. We define its edges and boundaries. Our dysfunctional consumption renders the consumption of intoxication culture functional. In his paper, The Social Model of Disability, Tom Shakespeare explains the difference between the social and individual models of disability. He writes that the individual model defines disability in terms of individual deficit, and the social model defines disability as a social creation, a relationship between people with impairment and a disabling society. This framework can be used to understand the construction of the alcoholic and addict within intoxication culture. Through the individual model, the alcoholic and addict is understood as someone who is unable to live up to the standards of normal drinking set out by intoxication culture. There is something wrong with the alcoholic and addict which make them unable to drink normally. The social model moves the gaze from the alcoholic and addict and turns it on intoxication culture itself. The social model asks us to consider that intoxication culture produces a standard of alcohol consumption and positions it as the norm. The pervasiveness and unquestioned role of alcohol consumption in our lives creates barriers for those of us who cannot or do not want to consume alcohol in a normal way. For those of us who need to stay sober in order to stay alive, intoxication culture can be incredibly alienating and inaccessible. Intoxication culture is dependent on the alcoholic and addict to remain normal. It needs an abject other through which to define itself. The other, through which it defines itself, is not static, however. Just as what is considered normal drinking shifts depending on the context, so is the alcoholic and addict constructed in multiple ways. The construction of the alcoholic and addict, and thus the treatment of the alcoholic and addict, varies based on a number of factors. Alcoholism and addiction intersect in various ways with other social categories, such as race, sex, class, ability, age, sexual orientation, trans or cis identity, and so on. The construction of the alcoholic and addict also varies based on the substances the alcoholic or addict most commonly consume and the ways in which they consume them. My focus today will be on the construction of the female alcoholic and addict, which is always complicated by other intersecting social positions. The narratives attached to the female alcoholic and addict's body that I will be considering are the perpetual sexual availability of the female alcoholic and addict's body, the female alcoholic and addict's body as a place of inherent victimization, and the drunk or high woman as a transgressor of gendered boundaries. I argue that intoxication culture constructs the female addict and alcoholic in particular ways which produce and legitimize a culture of sexual violence and violence against women. I challenge all of us to consider the ways that intoxication culture is complicit in a larger culture of sexual violence. Recently, I came across the work of a local photographer who takes pictures of drug-addicted, homeless, and street-involved people in Toronto. The photographs offer a voyeuristic look into the world of poverty and addiction from a safe and comfortable distance. They allow non-addicts and housed, non-street-involved people to consume addiction and homelessness. While the photographs are presented as a real and uncensored view of addiction and street life, they are, I argue, a construction. Like all representations, they say more about the producer and consumers of the images than they do about the people being photographed. I will not be sharing these images with you today because I do not want to further add to the exploitation of marginalized members of our communities, but I bring them up because I think they offer important insight into the ways addiction is constructed and conceptualized. A full and complex analysis of these images would be useful, but is beyond the scope of the work we are doing here today. What I would like to draw attention to is a striking and specific way that women are presented in these pictures. In several of the photographs, the women are completely naked. None of the men are photographed this way. While I argue that all of the images are constructions and not objective renditions of truth, I am struck by the specificity and the implications of this construction. The street-involved and drug-addicted woman is presented as already completely naked. Her body and her sexuality are on display, accessible to the voyeuristic photographer and viewer. The already invasive camera lens becomes even more invasive when it is turned on the body of a woman. This representation of the female addict as sexually accessible is not new. It is a commonly held belief that a drunk or high woman is at risk of or even asking for sexual assault. In an article entitled How to Prevent Date Rape on a website called WikiHow, the first 3 suggestions pertain to regulating alcohol use. They are: avoid becoming intoxicated in public and at parties. Keep yourself to a 1 to 2 drink limit. Always keep your eye on every beverage you consume, and once you lose sight of your drink, do not consume it anymore. These suggestions are meant to be helpful, and they may reduce a woman's likelihood of being assaulted. However, they also reinforce a culture of sexual violence in which date rape is presented as a naturally occurring threat, one that it is women's responsibility to prevent by participating in intoxication culture in particular ways. The subtext is that a woman should know better than to get drunk in public. Simultaneously, intoxication culture calls for public alcohol use. This contradiction turns a woman's intoxication into the reason for her assault. In order to be considered normal within the framework of intoxication culture, she needs to be able to consume alcohol socially and publicly. Yet if she does so, this can be cited as the reason if she is sexually assaulted. The link between alcohol consumption and vulnerability to sexual violence is a gendered one. It is not implicit within intoxication culture that anyone who is publicly intoxicated is at risk of sexual violence. That risk is relegated to women. In her paper, Too Drunk to Say No, Anik Meyer writes that the premise of alcohol consumption producing vulnerability is selectively applied. It is not applied to men, whose binge drinking is seen to cause aggressive behavior. This disparity indicates that intoxication culture is complicit with a larger culture of sexual violence against women. The connection between sexual violence and alcohol use is not, as it is commonly believed, that alcohol makes people vulnerable to assault because of their impaired judgment and awareness. Rather, intoxication culture produces a script in which female drunkenness is read as female sexual accessibility. Meyer explains that when being part of a drinking culture becomes the equivalent of consenting to sex, women are effectively held accountable for rape involving alcohol. The addict or alcoholic woman who is frequently intoxicated becomes inherently sexually accessible. These constructions legitimize violence and remove the responsibility from the perpetrator, placing it onto the woman's intoxicated body. Rather than the assault being about the perpetrator's violence, it becomes about the victim's intoxication. This makes sexual violence against female addicts and alcoholics an apparently natural phenomenon, something that happens to her because of the type of woman that she is. According to Meyer, rape involving alcohol is reconfigured as a problem of female binge drinking rather than male rape. Sexual violence is not the only form of violence against women condoned by intoxication culture. Physical violence is also legitimized by intoxication culture as a means of regendering drunk or high women who have transgressed the gendered boundaries of a white passive femininity. I will use an example from my own experience to illustrate this point. During the period of my life when I was actively drinking, I experienced many violent assaults, both physical and sexual. Once, after I had been binge drinking for several hours, I was riding the streetcar with a female friend who was also very drunk. We were joking and laughing with each other in a very loud and obnoxious way, and we were taking up a lot of space. The behavior we were exhibiting is behavior not uncommonly exhibited by groups of young, drunk men. The streetcar was crowded. A young man sitting near us told us to shut the fuck up. We continued with our behavior. Soon, a group of men standing near the exit started yelling at us to be quiet. The streetcar driver then came over the PA system and announced that we were being asked to leave the streetcar. We got up and walked towards the exit, continuing our loud and obnoxious behavior. I stood on the step, ready to exit the streetcar. When the door opened, a man standing behind me picked me up by my waist and threw me face first off the streetcar. I landed on the street, breaking my glasses. I was physically hurt and emotionally shocked by the violent act. A group of men standing on the street who witnessed me being thrown off the streetcar began to yell at the man who had thrown me, shouting things like, "That's not cool, you don't hit a woman." After I had picked up the pieces of my glasses and was standing on the sidewalk, the men continued talking to me and my friend, stating that they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. One of the men casually said to another, "You don't hit a woman, that's not right. The only time I ever hit a woman is when she was acting like a man." When he said those words, I realized why I had been thrown off the streetcar. I was acting like a man. My drunk, obnoxious, loud behavior contradicted my small, female, feminine body. I realized that the men currently offering their support would probably not be if they had seen the behavior I was exhibiting prior to my attack. Because alcohol and drugs lower inhibitions, they can offer an opportunity for a drunk or high woman to act in ways that break traditional gender roles. Violence is seen as a legitimate way to reinstate order by returning her to a state of passivity. Intoxication culture is complicit in a culture of sexual violence and violence against women. Within the structure of intoxication culture are narratives that position alcoholic and addict women as inherently sexually accessible, drunk and high women as asking for assault, intoxicated female bodies as the source and cause of violence, and physical violence as a legitimate means of reinstating gendered order. Intoxication culture is not a neutral and natural state of affairs in which violence occurs because of certain people's inability to drink properly. Rather, it is a system which promotes and legitimizes violence by producing a paradoxical situation in which women are expected to drink publicly and then are blamed for doing so. The alcoholic and addict are borders which delineate the normal from the abnormal. The state of being both female and an alcoholic or addict is positioned as the reason for the violence that happens to female alcoholics and addicts. Binge drinking, which often falls into the category of normal behavior within intoxication culture, can shift and become constructed as the failure of the drinker and the cause of her assault. These narratives, which are sewn into the fabric of intoxication culture, remove all responsibility for violence from the perpetrator. Violence becomes natural, and women are encouraged to drink responsibly, but of course are still encouraged to drink. It is a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. I am an alcoholic and an addict. I cannot safely consume drugs or alcohol because I cannot control the amount that I consume. I am also a woman. The intersection of my femaleness and my alcoholism has created a narrative which states that I was not really assaulted when I was, and that I was really asking for it when I was not. While I was actively drinking, my life was dangerous and I was frequently assaulted. On top of the trauma from being assaulted, I also experienced the shame and guilt imposed upon me from a culture that insists this violence was partially, if not entirely, my fault. For a long time, I continued to try to drink normally, so that I could feel included and welcomed in a culture that pervasively and uncritically includes and insists upon alcohol use. I have been asked many times why I can't just drink normally, and I tortured myself for years, risking my life many times in search of the answer. In Disability Politics and Theory, A.J. Withers suggests that the social model, while a definite improvement from the individual model, is not enough. They write, "We put social meaning onto people's bodies and minds. Impairments shift depending on the context that it is experienced in. There is no such thing as a biological reality that creates impairment. Impairment is socially constructed and imposed upon us, just as disability is." They offer the radical model as an alternative. Radical disability politics, they write, is grounded in the belief that the systems that oppress us, not us, are fundamentally flawed. The individual model says there is something wrong with me, that I am flawed for being unable to consume alcohol normally. The social model says that intoxication culture defines itself through abnormal drinkers like me, creating a situation where my inability to drink is constructed as a failure. The radical model says that intoxication culture is inherently flawed, that defining normalcy through a standard of alcohol consumption is oppressive. Now that I am sober and in recovery, I still regularly have to be in environments where alcohol is served and where people are getting drunk. If I want to go to a music or art show, a social event, out to dinner, or even ride the subway on a Friday night, I have to be around intoxication because I am living in an intoxication culture. This can be difficult for me because I need to not drink in order to stay alive, and I am committed to staying alive. For those of you who are not addicts or alcoholics, for those of you who are not positioned as sexually accessible if you drink, for those of you who do not see a problem with the fact that the vast majority of social events include alcohol, I am asking you to turn on your critical analysis. For those of you who are alcoholics and addicts, in recovery or actively using, for those of you who have been told you don't consume alcohol normally, for those of you who are positioned as at risk for assault if you get drunk or high, I am inviting you to politicize your experience. I am asking all of us to look at and think deeply about the role that alcohol and drug consumption play in our lives, and the way this impacts alcoholics, addicts, and so-called normal drinkers. I am asking all of us to consider the ways that intoxication culture promotes a culture of sexual violence, and for all of us to take responsibility for that, instead of simply telling women to drink responsibly. I am asking us to stop taking intoxication culture for granted and to imagine that things could be different. I am calling for radical sobriety as an alternative to intoxication culture. Radical sobriety does not mean that none of us should use drugs or alcohol. It does mean that we complicate, problematize, and question our relationships to substances and our culturally produced standards of alcohol use. Radical sobriety means a dedication to implementing sober spaces in our communities. It means interrogating intoxication culture for its role as an oppressive system, and it means that we do this together.
Hi. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'll be discussing the idea of intoxication culture as a colonizing tool that has, over time, been used to hail certain bodies into nation statehood, citizenship, and patriotism, while damning others to be left in the margins. Also, I aim to look at how this relationship between alcohol, drugs, nationalism, and colonization is structured through space. I will be engaging with these ideas through a lens that is critical of colonialism. My work is drawn upon the research I've done in areas of colonialism, law, race, and space theory. I mainly draw upon the work of Shireen Razak and Nick Riedfag, in tandem with the ideas and theories of Judith Halberstam as they relate to identity and space construction. I'm sorry, I speak really fast when I'm nervous, I'm so sorry. Bear with me. No, I know. Okay.
Sorry, Chris, I just need to slow down, that's all.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you need me to repeat anything?
Yeah, the last, the authors, if we could go back to the two,
Just the
two
authors?
authors' names, back
Sure.
to that sentence, the beginning of it for me.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Sorry about that.
No, no problem.
My work is drawn upon the research I've done in areas of colonialism, law, race, and space theory. I mainly draw upon the work of Shireen Razak and Nick Riedfag in tandem with the ideas and theories of Judith Halberstam as they relate to identity and space construction. So the position with which I approach my research is that of a white cisgender queer woman from a low-income background. I also come from a background of alcohol and drug abuse, and am myself a recovering addict and alcoholic. As I am merely presenting my thoughts and ideas and the research I've done on the topic, I can only share from this position of experience and research. I'm so, do you need me to go back and repeat anything?
Back to the beginning. No, you know what, it just needs to be slowed down a bit, I'm
Sure.
sorry.
No, I
Thank you.
apologize. So the main questions of my research are, how does colonialism speak to and construct the addict and a culture of intoxication? How is this produced in time and space? And how does intoxication culture continue to oppress certain populations while rewarding others? First, what is intoxication culture and why is it important for the discussion of race and space construction? I first came across this idea in Nick Riedfag's anarchist zine, Towards a Less Fucked Up World. This specific issue was titled Sobriety and the Anarchist Struggle. I consider intoxication culture to be a culture in which intoxication is not only normalized, but also expected. For the purposes of my research, I understand intoxication culture to be a culture within which spaces have been constructed in order to normalize the capitalistic enterprise of inebriation, pushing those who do not wish to engage in such a transaction to the margins of intelligibility. I express that the idea of intoxication culture is important to the conversation of race as it relates to alcohol consumption and space construction, because I take the position that intoxication culture is in itself a tool of white supremacy. I argue that this tool aims to encourage the passivity of racialized communities and individuals. I argue that it does so while constructing spaces that structure the relationship with alcohol and drugs within oppressed communities and racialized individuals as something abnormal. Is that better? Yeah, okay. Nick Riedfag addresses the prevalence of addiction within oppressed communities. He addresses drug and alcohol use in Black communities, Indigenous communities, and queer communities. Nick Riedfag also acknowledges the role the state has played in the development of a dependent relationship between oppressed communities and drugs, such as the CIA involvement in the introduction of crack in urban Black communities in the United States. As an example of a form of resistance that I would argue positions sobriety as a tool of decolonization, the Black Liberation Movement rectified policies of prohibition within their communities. The Zapatista societies of Mexico are dry communities. Indigenous communities across Turtle Island ban and still do ban alcohol from their communities and reserves as a form of identity reclamation and culture regeneration. Riot Fag quotes Frederick Douglass as stating, "When a slave was drunk, the slaveholder had no fear that he would plan an insurrection, no fear that he would escape to the north. It is the sober, thinking slave who was dangerous and needed the vigilance of his master to keep him slave." As I have stated, I think it is important to acknowledge these relationships and their utility for state rule and citizen pacification. For the purposes of my research, I have sought answers to the questions that pertain to citizenship and patriotic rhetoric, which I argue has been instrumental in the development of relationships of dependence and the introduction of drugs and alcohol into oppressed communities. What I find of interest here is the spaces in which the relationship oppressed communities have had with substances has encouraged a relationship of dependence, addiction, and a larger societal stigmatization. Similarly, I have noticed that the rhetoric of recovery follows a similar nationalistic, white supremacist, capitalist discourse, which unfortunately I do not have time to go into today. Drawing from this, I plan to discuss racial categories and identity as a system that deciphers who can access nation, land, and citizenship, and how this interacts with alcohol, drugs, and recovery. Race Act states that race and space are constructed through racial and spatial boundaries as to keep the colonized in their place, which is to be out of place. Race Act is stating that the ways in which spaces are constructed, specifically in our North American white supremacist culture is to reduce visibility as racialized individuals and communities while selling the idea of assimilation to these communities through various means. I would argue that one of these means is the proper method of intoxication and substance usage. The construction of a proper method of intoxication creates a binarism that constructs an improper method of usage, as Geoff stated earlier in the presentation. As Razak argues that the prospects of white supremacy are reliant on the construction of space in racialized terms, I will, in tandem, argue that improper usage or improper inebriation within oppressed communities is seen as a complication for nation statehood and as a threat and problem for white supremacy. Shireen Razak considers the relationship between alcohol policies and land settlement in British Columbia in her book, Race, Space, and the Law. In Chapter 2, Razak states that the process of colonizing British Columbia was contingent on the strict enforcement of liquor laws. The liquor laws enforced by white settler government dictated who can drink where and with whom. As Razak suggests, the regulation of liquor was about space. As such, alcohol was once only available to citizens of the Canadian state, not inclusive of Indigenous folks. Before the differentiation of the status and non-status Indian came into existence. It was also available only to those citizens who could reproduce state nationalism through a heterosexual discourse. It has been evident through my research that colonialism plays an important role in the establishment and normalization of heterosexuality. Upon discussing this with my colleague Clementine, she summed it up as such: if you control who drinks together, you control who fucks. At first, I laughed at this thought, but then realized its truth and profundity. The relationship that alcohol, colonialism, and race have is such to continue a white statehood through heterosexual procreation. It is space construction that ensures the continuation of a pure white race, which would continue the legacy of the nation state.
Amy, I'm going to give you this mic instead because it might be better.
Okay.
All right.
Is it on?
It's on.
Is this, that's a lot better. Okay. So what I find interesting about this relationship, thank you. So what I find interesting about this relationship is that the consumption and purchasing of liquor was once only available to the white heterosexual patriot subject. So where white settlers were once the only ones allowed to purchase and drink alcohol, Indigenous folks and people of color were not allowed to by legislative rule. We can see these attitudes still prevalent in the marketing of certain alcoholic products, such as Geoff mentioned earlier in this presentation with the products such as Molson Canadian. Upon watching a commercial for the product, it is almost impossible to not recognize the nationalistic rhetoric prevalent in much of the company's marketing. where Canadian pride is built on the consumption of this beverage, and once having purchased and drank this product, you're able to claim, I am Canadian. We can see this nationalist discourse manifest in certain spaces constructed for the purpose of buying and consuming alcohol. For example, I want you to imagine yourself walking down King Street on a Friday night. The bars are full and everyone is trying to get laid. Who do you see? Who's in the bars? How old are they? What color is their skin? What is their gender representation? Now, how about if you imagine yourself walking by Queen Weston Bathurst at any given time of day or night? Who do you see? How or what are they drinking? Are they using drugs in a public space? Are they racialized or are they white? Spaces such as these are constructed with invisible borders that are dictated by race as constructed by white supremacy. In her research, Razak focuses on the illegality of alcohol consumption for Native folks, which defined a racial boundary that was integral to the heterosexual policing of Native folks in British Columbia. The Native identity was constructed as a non-heterosexual, non-white other who threatened the white, Eurocentric compilation of nationalistic identity. This in turn was concretized as heavily policed liquor laws and laws pertaining to interracial sex relations. As Razak notes in her work, liquor laws and the construction of spaces and borders are also very much about sex. They are about the mixing of cultures, an idea that reiterates eugenic ideas. It is through the colonization of space that race can be managed, heterosexuality solidified, and the legacy of white Canadian statehood continued. This nationalistic consumption and intoxication is undoubtedly reified through systems of white supremacy. I would argue that, as Geoff stated earlier in the presentation, that the ideology of othering is used for people to identify as addicted or non-addicted people. The idea of othering, as David Goldberg states, is used for white supremacy, constructs itself by conceptualizing order anew, and then by reproducing spatial confinement and separation in these renewed terms. If we apply this idea to the construct of the addict, we can see this as it relates to spatial construction in urban areas. I think it's important that we question how these spaces come to exist, and through which processes can these invisible borders tied up in race, addiction, and discrimination begin to be dismantled. In her article, Razak discusses the legalization of alcohol for Indigenous folks in Canada and the problem of the problem of Indian drunkenness, the state was then presented with. This was faced with policies that once again outlawed the sale of alcohol to Indigenous folks. The anxiety of the white Canadian state faced in regards to the problem of the drunken Indian related to their desire to build and reform a respectable white society, as the pervasiveness of alcoholism and addiction in communities deeply affected and destroyed by colonialism presented a problem to the sustaining of this patriotic imaginative. I'd like to briefly use an example that I've come across in my research. In 2001, John Stackhouse, a journalist for the Globe and Mail, published an article called Welcome to Harlem on the Prairies. The article, as discussed by Greg Prolix, a Métis professor of anthropology at McMaster University, claims to be written to empower Aboriginal folks who live in this Harlem on the Prairies, while asking the reader to be the judge of the plausibility of peaceful Aboriginal settler relations. Instead, what I find that Stackhouse does is utilize what I've discussed here, white supremacist discourse and rhetorics of nationalism and racism, to construct both the identities of racialized folks who he silences and the white authoritarian settler who he puts on a pedestal. Pictures that accompany this article are those of drunk Indians being carried into police cars, and of course concerned white police officers looking on and doing their duty for the nation state by sweeping the streets of this Canadian Harlem clean of the problem of race integration in the pursuit of maintaining borders constructed around race, alcohol consumption, and drug consumption. In the article, the only racialized folks who are given voice are those who work directly for the government through judicial services. Upon investigating this relationship, Prolix quotes Jeanne Bouleman in saying, "Since the police and other keepers of the peace in urban and reservation areas have the same values as rulers of the American society, they perceive public inebriation as an ultimate degradation, a fall from civilization. They judge Indians who drink publicly even more harshly than the individual white, because Indians, as a group, seem to have been born uncivilized, with no shame about their categorical degradation." I urge you all to read the article, Welcome to Harlem on the Prairies by John Stackhouse, and draw your own conclusions about what is being said and what is being reified. The privilege of those who are able to drink in certain spaces, such as at bars on weekends and Friday nights, over lunch with the buddies, or with mimosas at brunch with the girls, are constructed upon their relationship within racial borders that dictate who is not allowed to access this privilege. It is this privileged relationship to alcohol and drugs that is a large part of the patriotic imagination, which boasts proper consumption as a nationalistic duty. The statement I wish to close with is this. Given the nature of our culture as one of intoxication, and seeing the connections that intoxication has with colonialism and racism, how can we work together towards a community and a society that operates in a framework of accessibility? This means an accessibility for racialized folks, status and non-status natives, immigrants, queer folks, the addicted and non-addicted alike. I'd like to ask what this means for you personally. Does this mean you interrogate your own relationship with substances and alcohol? Does it mean you're more conscientious of the spaces in which you drink? Or does it mean that you work with your community to make events dry and alcohol-free and accessible for all? To interrogate intoxication culture, we must truly investigate the ways in which intoxication, alcohol, and drugs have shaped our lives and experiences, as how it has worked to construct ideas, identities, and the spaces associated with those identities. It has become evident to me through my research that to interrogate intoxication culture is to interrogate a deep-rooted racist, nationalistic, and colonial discourse. If we truly want to create a culture of accessibility, then we must redefine our relationship with that which aims to render us incapacitated to do so, both individually and collectively. Thank you.
Well, I'd just like to thank all our presenters tonight, or today rather. It was an excellent presentation from you all. Let's have another round of applause for everybody. Okay, so we have 30 minutes left for questions. So I'd just like to invite the audience to pose their questions, and I'll hand the mic out to those who need it.
Quinto will help out too.
Quinto will help out as well.
Thank you. Okay. First of all, wow, fantastic presentations, and I'm so glad to hear it. Because I think, yeah, it's too long in coming. Too long we have talked about, addiction only from the medical model of disability and not looked at the social construction. This is actually really the first time I've heard that talked about, which is kind of a sad statement. I suppose I wanted to get your thoughts, get your reactions to the idea of situating. You guys have looked at intoxication culture in the very specific context of drugs and alcohol, but I would want to throw out there into the floor the idea of, in fact, broadening the notion of intoxication culture to think about consumerism as intoxication culture. I mean, is not the whole point of advertising to convince us that we need substances, things, shopping, purchasing to make us happy, to fulfill us, and in fact to instill in us the constant need to consume, whether it's drugs or alcohol or, DVDs or, tech gadgets or whatever. And don't get me wrong, I love tech gadgets, but, so I'm thinking, the one thing I sort of didn't hear discussed, someone did mention capitalism. I'm glad someone said the C word, but, just to talk about that larger context of consumerism, in fact, pushing an intoxication culture. And I think our last speaker, I'm sorry, I'm awful with names, was bang on about it being a way of sort of trying to get us all too noddle-headed to be able to think clearly about our oppression. So I wanted to get your reactions to that.
So I'm sure who wants to field that question.
I guess I'll start with that one. Thank you. I think that's a great question, and I would absolutely agree. You said just broadening this idea of intoxication culture to include consumerism in a capitalist culture, and I would absolutely agree. I think that's totally what it is. I think it's used for pacification, right? Kind of as I stated in the presentation. Does anybody else want to add to that? That's kind of a left out right now.
I guess I would just like to add that, like, I agree with your thoughts, and there is a culture of normative, addictive consumerism. Like, that's what it is, right? And I think that it's, what I've been thinking about recently is, like, when we think about that idea there, when we think about the addictive consumerism of, like I guess, like, a lot of the part of the world, and also, well, what sort of implication does that have on, like, the real addict, in quotations? Like, I'm talking about, like, whatever, how many people identify, but how does that, like, work together with each other?
And there's a question from the floor, and two people in the room who aren't aware. The person asking the question is deaf, and the voice you're hearing is that of the interpreter. So my question is in two parts. My question, the first part of my question is, I want to ask the panelists, I want to ask their view on so I wanted to ask you about the use of prescription drugs and radical sobriety, and the other